You gotta love those forced confessions.
Right. Hey guys, just a heads up real quick. We are live. I've got the overlay on and I've got a pre-game chat up. So just so we don't have any viewers just yet, but we are still waiting for Teddy. She hasn't popped up yet. But yeah, we are. So we are live. But I do have it kind of emphasized as a pre-game chat.
Okay, well then whoever sees this later on, welcome to CSG, y'all.
Exactly. CSG is taking over. But
Hey, where's David at? Is he in on this? Where's he at?
no, David unfortunately is stuck at the DMV, man, and
Oh, what a
so
dirty commie.
yeah, I know
I
he's
never liked that guy, to be honest. Yeah.
Oh, I
You're a
hope the
jerk.
2 viewers that are watching, one's not David, but, if it
He's
is
such a
for the
heretic, though. You know what I
he
mean?
is.
Yeah.
Ain't he a heretic, though? I mean, whenever I think of the definition of heretic, I mean, David is who pops up in my mind. But no, I'm just playing. But for the 2 viewers that we do have watching, thank you all for joining us. This is the pre-game chat, and so we are still waiting for Teddy. She is on her way. She messaged us earlier, and we will get started here momentarily. Again, thank you for joining us. We got a good topic about the Shroud of Turin. We got the expert. We got Dale Glover with us as well. Kind of, what would you say? You kind of 75%, 72% convinced that the Shroud is, authentic, is what it, people say that it is. We have Joshua Davidson, my co-host from CSG, with us, who's kind of a right at that 51%. And then me, I'm more of the skeptic, I guess you could say, on this discussion. I do have some things that I would like to bring up, and we're waiting on Teddy. But
If just this is like the pre stuff. If you
yeah,
want the exact percentage, I just went to my kind of write up.
okay,
It's 70.15% is what I ended up with.
fair enough.
Oh man.
What? Let me ask you this, though, George, real quick. What is the 0.15? Like, is that an argument by itself, or what
Is
is
that your
that?
bias acknowledgement?
It's just yeah, well, it's the way I, I went through it. Like I always round to two decimal places because for whatever reason decimals come up when I'm building like a cumulative case. But
Sure.
yeah, so that's just the way I am. I always round to the nearest two decimal places of percent. But yeah, essentially when I get into my methodology, there's three components to that, and then when I multiplied that together for that, that's where I ended up. But
Yeah.
yeah, I'll explain that a little bit more when we get to methodology.
Right on. Right on. Oh, Daniel Lowry has a question for you, Dale, real quick. He said, Dale, are you employing Bayes?
So I wasn't necessarily in terms of the three things. It's just straightforward multiplication in terms of each of these elements.
Hmm.
So I didn't really use or need to use Bayes here. Um, in terms of the Shroud of Turin, I'm trying to think. I only use Bayes' theorem when it's like a cumulative case, trying to get a cumulative probability.
Hmm.
So once I got this number, this 70.15, and I had whatever percentage I had for the historical facts proving the resurrection, my vindication argument, then I plugged these into Bayes' theorem to get my total is Christianity true or false type thing.
Hmm.
Fair enough. So, since I don't know, what exactly is Bayes' theorem?
Basically, so it's in probability calculus. It's
Okay.
a mathematical formula that essentially allows you to kind of calculate. Okay, what is the cumulative case probability? And the way I used it is okay. So we have a hypothesis: is Christianity true?
Hmm.
And when I was a non-believer, I said, okay, well, let me look at various bits of positive evidences. So, okay, we might have the shroud, the evidence from the shroud. Does that prove Christianity is true? Whatever. The evidence for the resurrection, the traditional Gary Habermas type argument and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
Um, and then on the other side, there's also negative evidences. So these are things that show no, Christianity is false. So things like inerrancy issues, moral mistakes, human factors, so, stuff like that. And then I assigned like my own subjective probabilities to each of these factors. And then I plug that into Bayes' theorem, and it tells you, okay, overall, what do you come out as? So back in 2018, I plugged in all these factors, and I came out to 53.14% that Christianity is true. And it was that point that, well, it's more probable than not. So I became a Christian and started doing my thing as a Christian, became an apologist.
Man, that is so interesting. I'd love to have you on CSG to talk about that just in and of itself, like how Bayes' theorem kind of goes into that, man. Daniel did, or not more so of a question, more so of a statement. I think a Bayesian approach to the Shroud would be a pretty fruitful route for future research. There's almost no discussion of epistemology in Shroud studies.
Yeah. I definitely think it can be helpful, kind of thing. I'm a huge proponent of Bayes' theorem and applying it, and that sort of thing. I do get into some kind of epistemology myself. Obviously, we'll kind of cover that at least in terms of like how do we identify a given event, such as the formation of the Shroud's images. Well, how do we identify that as a sign? So I do get into that aspect. So yeah.
Right on. Well, we did just hear from Teddy. She is having laptop issues. It isn't supporting the link. So she's downloading Chrome. I think it has something to do with her internet browser. But she is downloading Chrome right now and will be joining us momentarily. So again, to our guests that are watching, thank you so much for tuning in to the Shroud of Turin with Teddy Pappas, Dale Glover. I am your host, well, your co-host, Tyler Fowler, with my co-host from CSG, Joshua Davidson. We're going to be getting into the history of the Shroud of Turin, the science behind it, skeptic claims and rebuttals, and what the present, like what's going on with the Shroud now and what the future holds. So as soon as Teddy joins us, we will get started here momentarily and dive into this. Josh, I'm going to ask you this again. But let me do this. What are your thoughts on Bayes' theorem? Since that's kind of like what we're talking about right now. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Not that I would be qualified to say. I mean, I think I vaguely understand the idea of like putting quantity to the idea of probability and things like that and making judgments based on data, but it's not like I've ever actually used it for anything or gone through any kind of calculus course to learn it formally. So I don't really know anything beyond what its function should be. But I mean, I think that it's pretty standard practice to look at something like a historical claim and then judge it based on probability and plausibility, rather than saying just plainly yes or no, because we don't have access to that event the same way that we have access to things that are repeatable. And so you have to judge them differently. You know what I mean?
Right. It's kind of like a good tool from what I sound like, because I've never heard of Bayes' theorem, to be honest with you guys, until now. But it sounds like a good tool to use to answer that question. Well, why do we believe what we believe? Would that be accurate?
Or at least believe what we believe about some things. It's not like everything, I think the way that it's applied, and forgive me if I'm mistaken, but I think the way that it's applied is more so to the idea of whether or not something is more probable than not, so that you can say, with some level of confidence that you affirm it, rather than saying, I have 100% proof, like repeatable proof that this is, because it's not an observable thing. We're not going back to the first century and watching Jesus come back to life to imprint himself onto a shroud. It's like, instead we're trying to discern from what's present what we can't actually access. And so there has to be some way of judging whether or not that's even a reasonable case or not. And there has to be some falsifiability to a claim in order to find it reliable. If you can't prove something false, you also can't prove it true. And so there has to be some measure by which you judge, like, this is more plausible, less plausible, more possible, less possible kind of thing. Am I following, Dale?
Yeah. So yeah, you're exactly right. So it comes down to, look, you comparing and contrasting hypotheses. So what's the probability that the hypothesis is true given the evidence? You also have to look at that fundamental aspect, that the probability that it's false, kind of thing, in light of various hypotheses. So famously, Tim McGrew and Lydia McGrew listeners will. Is this on PORA's website?
Yeah.
Well,
Yep.
okay, so some of the listeners then they would know that I posted up their article on the resurrection, and they use a proper Bayesian approach to proving the resurrection from the historical evidence and that sort of thing. Richard Swinburne's used it, and that one thing I should say in terms of my own use of Bayes' theorem, so just so I'm not tricky and when I don't use the proper approach, so I don't use conditional probabilities and that sort of thing. I just kind of do a more straightforward approach in terms of assessing, okay, what do I think the subjective probability value for this bit of evidence is, and then I plug that into Bayes. So I just use Bayes more of, I want to get that cumulative thing. Here are the numbers. What does it equal out in the end, kind of thing.
Right on, man. Right on. And just to remind me real quick, what did you say that the percentage was for the Shroud of Turin?
For the Shroud of Turin, it came out
70.15.
70.15%.
Right on, man. Right on. Josh, is there anything you want to kind of bring up in regards to the Shroud of Turin for this little pregame chat while we're waiting on Teddy, or?
Maybe just a shout out that my favorite coverage of this so far has hands down been Braxton Hunter and Jonathan Pritchett from Trinity Radio discussing a chapter from a book that was edited by Mike Licona. And it was a really awesome kind of, quirky. They're funny anyway, but Braxton has a way of taking things that normally sound drab and kind of like dry and making them exciting and very listenable. And Pritchett has a good way of breaking up the monotony with, a good jest or a punch here and there. It's very entertaining, but also very informative. So I think that from what I've seen so far of the things that I've been able to rediscover from the past, trying to look into things like this, and then trying to learn more so that I'm prepared to ask questions that are worth asking.
That's right.
So just kind of like going over what I had seen and things that I wanted to know about. That was the episode that I saw that pretty much really like kept my interest the entire time, and it's part 1, part 2 kind of thing, and it was really good. It was really good.
Nice. Yeah, I enjoyed listening to the Shroud Wars reboot with Teddy and Hugh on Skeptics and Seekers. It's on Spotify, and if you just type in Shroud Wars reboot, it'll pop right up. But Dale, if you had a resource to share with our listeners about where to go to find more information on the Shroud of Turin, what's your favorite resource?
Yeah, well, so in the first place, I was going to post up that show along with on my site, but so believe it or not, I am the originator of the Shroud Wars. That happened because of me. So I've got several Shroud Wars debates on my channel. On Real Seeker, my blog, Real Seeker Ministries.wordpress.com, or in YouTube if you just search Real Seekers and then search for like Shroud Wars. So I originally did a couple Shroud Wars debates. Number one, can we prove the Shroud is medieval? So that was kind of where the skeptic had the burden of proof. And then the second one I did was, can we prove that the Shroud's not medieval? And that's where I had the burden of proof to prove that it's not. I also have an entire series of Shroud solo shows that, Daniel Lowry in the audience, he's familiar with it, and that sort of thing. And that's where I go into like a lot of detail laying out the case and the evidence for the Shroud in terms of the history and my own scientific case. So I think I'm up to like part 14 now, I think. So
oh wow, yeah, the first thing I type in on YouTube whenever I just type in Shroud Wars is Shroud Wars 1 Barry Schwartz interview.
Gotcha. So that's mine. Yeah. So that was back when I was the host of Skeptics and Seekers. That was just kind of a straightforward interview where I had like an atheist and myself kind of interview Barry Schwartz, who's one of the foremost Shroud experts and
he was the photographer, right?
He was the official photographer. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that was the one that they were reading a chapter that was written by him on the one I was just mentioning with Braxton and Pritchett. They were reading that chapter from I believe he was the author of the chapter that they were going over when they were doing it. So that's really actually very cool that you've spoken directly to that guy.
Oh yeah, he's a friend, person. Like I've talked to him a lot and stuff like that. I'm planning to have him back on sometime in the summer if he's up for it and kind of thing.
Cool.
Oh wow,
right on.
So yeah.
Who was it? What was his name again?
Barry Schwartz. He
Barry.
runs.
Oh,
You know, yeah.
okay. So Barry Short, he was the guy you said, Josh, that he was the photographer.
Yeah, he was the official
Oh, okay.
photographer for the
I'm with
original
you.
research team. I forget Spurt or something, SPRT, right?
Sure.
ST
Yeah.
STRP. Yeah, that's what it was. Yeah, he was the original. He was on the original team. He was doing the officiated photography, and I don't think he's actually Jewish, right? He's not Christian.
He's not a Christian. Yeah, he was
Wow.
so he runs shroud.com, which is the number one site. You know, you want pro, you want Shroud skeptic stuff. He's got everything on that website there. But yeah, he was kind of an unbeliever. He was definitely like skeptical towards the Shroud, and it was basically through the science. And it took him about 17 years after Stirp in 1978. But it was through the evidence from the Shroud that he became a believer in God. He's still not a Christian yet; he's Jewish, but you know he's very open to it, and he finds the evidence very compelling, just on strict scientific grounds.
Really? So does he affirms the validity of the Shroud then, or?
Yep. He affirms the historical authenticity. He says that thing
Okay.
covered Jesus, but he doesn't believe that the images are miraculous or that, or he's agnostic.
Oh. Okay, because there are, so correct me if I'm wrong, but are there multiple theories on how the image actually got onto the Shroud?
Oh, of course. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't know yet. Like in terms of the scientific evidence, we can't prove how it was created. We can prove how it was not created, and that's in part what convinces Barry and stuff like that is interesting and part of my case. But there are various extraordinary mechanisms of the people who advocate that this is a supernatural event, image formed at Jesus' resurrection. There are various proposals. I myself take kind of the same approach as a guy named Mark Antonacci and Bob Rucker. I think some kind of particle radiation
Hmm.
was involved in forming the images and that.
Okay. Okay. So just a heads up, guys. So we're having a little bit of technical difficulties with Teddy. She sent me a message, still trying to get it. I downloaded Chrome as it said, but it's still saying not supporting StreamYard's technology. She said she's still trying and that she's downloaded Firefox and Chrome and the link is not working for some reason. Um, that's
I'm
new to
using Chrome.
me. You're using Chrome? Okay.
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Let me message her back. Josh, do you have anything else that you would like to bring to the table for this pregame chat? You're muted, bud.
I was going to say he fell asleep. He's bored already.
I was going to ask Dale specifically, what tradition are you like adhered to? Are you a Protestant? Are you a Catholic? Or what denomination are you associated with if you are a Protestant?
Yeah, so I'm hardcore Protestant. I was a Baptist for most of my life.
Okay.
Uh, that's changed recently. I'm Presbyterian. I go to a Presbyterian church now, but I don't know the difference between the denominations on the front. But yeah,
Okay.
so I'm hardcore Protestant. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. And are you of the iconoclast type where you think that the second commandment violation of like making images and using relics for spiritual practices and things is actually a no-no?
No, like my old church, my old pastor definitely was. You can't even do Christmas plays because you can't represent and stuff like that. But for me,
Right.
it's about worshiping. If you're worshiping the image, then that's where it becomes wrong. But yeah, like I wouldn't feel totally comfortable like in a Catholic church with like statues around or like I don't know what they do there if they bend down or that sort of thing. But like yeah, so like to me it's the attitude of the heart. If you're worshiping images of creatures or something, that's where it's a sin, that's where it's idolatry.
Well, I guess do you make a distinction between what you mean by worshiping in your heart or venerating the thing that's the stand-in for what's in front of you? The way that they would have a statue of a saint is an icon, and it's supposed to be an additional help toward praying or meditating about a specific thing or overcoming a specific thing or asking for prayer from someone who's in the presence of God or something like that. Is all of those things are things that you hadn't really done much investigation into, or that you're like, because I'm in a position where I've been investigating a lot of things because I've, like you, was like hardcore Protestant, right? It's like I've come to a place where I realize that a lot of what I understood to be those practices was largely misunderstanding or elaborate straw men. And so I'm kind of really interested on that end because of the Shroud being like a lasting and still existing accessible relic of the church for at least, what, 800 years.
Mhm.
It's pretty impressive. And I know the kind of thing that's associated with church tradition in the Protestant mind, but I'm just kind of curious as to where you stand on some of those things, because for me, that's part of what it is we're talking about. It's not just the authenticity of some historical event, because none of us are actually questioning the resurrection. I'm just kind of wondering how that falls into your worldview, what it is that we're talking about,
So in terms of like myself, so I'm much more open now to like things like Catholic miracles or healings and stuff like that. Whereas before I would just like no assume it's got to be false, kind of thing. So it has kind of opened my mind to not be so assumptive and that sort of thing. Um, I guess it's part of my background. I still have a bit of uncomfortableness though with things like veneration, but I agree with what you're saying. It's you need to have this proper understanding of what they're actually teaching. Obviously,
Right.
they're not bowing down to a bunch of like pagan idols. So
Right.
yeah.
Hey guys, so Teddy is with us right now. She got it on. Welcome, Teddy. It is a pleasure. It is an honor to meet you.
Thank
ha-
you.
so we are in the pregame chat. We're live now. So let's go ahead and kick this intro off, and let's just go ahead and dive into it, shall we?
All
Thank
right.
you. Yes.
All right. I'll go ahead and mute everybody, and then we'll get started. What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to the CSG takeover of PORA. My name is Tyler Fowler. I'm one of the co-hosts of the Complete Sinner's Guide podcast, and with me is my brother from another mother, the second co-host of the Complete Sinner's Guide podcast, Mr. Joshua Davidson. Brother, how are you, and how excited are you to talk about the Shroud of Turin tonight?
I'm doing much better than yesterday. I had a previous back injury that reared its head, but I was able to rest for most of the day yesterday, and thank the Lord I got some decent sleep last night because of a muscle relaxer. I don't ever take medications, and so it really it smacked me like a train, man. I can still feel it, but I'm definitely a lot better this morning, and I'm thankful, and I am excited to talk about something that honestly for me has not been an emphasis in any of my studies, and so this is new. This is kind of an untrodden path for me this morning in a lot of ways, and God seems to supply us with the opportunity to talk to people who really know what they're talking about more often than not,
Right.
and I'm very excited and thankful for that. It's nice to meet you, Teddy. I've never actually gotten to have a conversation with you or anything like that before. So I'm just excited to meet you and Dale and have an opportunity to be a voice in the room. This is it's cool. I'll admit that I'm not qualified to have much of an opinion yet, but I definitely have some inquiries. So I'm excited to be able to do that.
Well, it's great to meet you too. And
I'm really in the same boat as Josh. I'm not qualified at all, so I'll be coming with some questions on this. But I do really appreciate the opportunity David has given Josh and I to sit down with you and Dell to talk about this. But you are the expert. You are the bear. Teddy Pappas, it is an honor to meet you, ma'am, and to
Wait, you're not a honey badger? Okay.
but yeah, go ahead and take a few minutes to introduce yourself. And for those who don't know you, I just want to ask up front, what is the story that initially got you so interested about the Shroud to dedicate so much time to divulging its secrets?
Well, I was around the age of 15, and it was around Easter time. And initially, I saw something on television. It was I don't know, either on the news or just something where they were just mentioning the Shroud of Turin. And so that stuck in my mind. And then I think it was maybe the next day or so, I was in the grocery store with my mother, and we were in the checkout lane, and I see a magazine cover that had the Shroud on it.
Okay.
And I was like, oh, second time. And so I was looking at it, and I was just mesmerized by the image. And it was saying that it was the burial cloth of Christ, or at least the purported burial cloth of Christ. And so I got very curious, and I asked my mom if we could go get a book on it. And so I read a book by Dr. Ken Stevenson and Dr. Gary Habermas called Verdict on the Shroud. And I have just been endlessly fascinated with this whole burial cloth for all of these years. But it's only been, I had done some intermittent research over the years, but it's only been in the past maybe year and a half that I've gotten really intense with my research. But it is extremely fascinating. And as a friend of mine, Joe Marino, has said, he's like, I can't imagine why everyone isn't just completely fascinated by it, because once you really know what it is, and when you start to look into it and you see the real solid scientific evidence behind it, I mean, what could be more interesting than evidence of the supernatural realm? So.
Sure. Absolutely. And I'm excited to dig into some of that, the history, the science behind the Shroud. But first, we have Mr. Dell Glover, last but not least, joining us. Brother, how are you, and how excited are you to dive into the Shroud of Turin tonight?
Yeah, I'm doing good. Thanks so much for having me. Obviously, I've been getting to know you guys for the last little bit, a couple minutes here, but so in terms of speaking about the Shroud, this is a talk that I think is very important. It was one of the four factors that led me to come to faith in Christ. So I think it's very important to share that evidence, and it might be of help to people. So yeah, I'm excited.
Now, just to clarify for everybody, you and Teddy have worked together doing different things on the Shroud of Turin. Can you go into a little bit of that for us, Dale?
Sure. So we were kind of speaking about Teddy's debate with Hugh and the Shroud Wars thing. So this is where I met. When I was the Christian host of Skeptics and Seekers, co-host of Skeptics and Seekers, I initiated this thing, what I called Shroud Wars. And I did some debates and some solo shows, and Teddy kind of heard my debate with the skeptic Alan there, and she loved it and said, oh, this is great. So she kind of became a loyal follower on our Skeptics and Seekers. And obviously I learned about her story and how she came into contact with the Shroud and that sort of stuff. And we've been kind of working together on that. Although Teddy has definitely surpassed me now. She's an actual expert, kind of working on the research and stuff with people. So yeah.
You know a lot too, Dale. Don't sell yourself short.
I try.
So can I ask, forgive my ignorance, can I ask, have either of you actually been in the tangible presence of this thing and like been involved in seeing and or, interacting with the object itself?
I have not. And I can't wait till it goes on exhibit the next time, because come hell or high water, I'm going to be there.
Teddy is going.
I don't blame you. I mean, it is pretty cool. And if it's your life's work, you do want to be in on, you want to be in on, because that's for me, I'm a musician. So if I had the opportunity to meet my favorite musicians and they were around, like you said, hell or high water, bro, I'm you know, I'm going to be try to be in on that for sure.
Because the thing is that you can't just go see the Shroud. It's for the longest time, it was rarely on exhibit, and the past couple of decades, it's been on exhibit more. There is talk. Now, I don't know if the whole pandemic might mess things up, but there has been talk that I think in maybe 2025, I think somebody had told me that Pope John Paul, there was some sort of Pope John Paul II had wanted it displayed on a certain important anniversary, which I'm not sure what that anniversary was for. But so I would assume that they might want to honor that if it can be done, given the whole pandemic situation.
Right on.
Maybe in about 3 years.
Right on, right on. So let's jump into this, shall we? So we see in church history the different images that pop up from time to time. For example, the image of Edessa, Veronica's veil, the Montepello image, right? What exactly, first of all, for those who don't know, for those who haven't heard of it, what exactly is the Shroud of Turin, and what's the story behind it? And also, one more, is there any connection between the Shroud of Turin and the image of Edessa or Veronica's veil or anything like that?
That's one of the things that I have been researching, and I am convinced that the Shroud of Turin is also the image of Edessa. There's actually very compelling evidence when the image of Edessa was brought to Constantinople in 944 AD. That same day, there was a speech given called the Narratio, and also the emperor and his sons and son-in-law saw the cloth, and they speak of seeing the whole image, the whole body, and they speak of seeing the eyes. Now, there's a question, and that's something that I've actually been working on. There's some conflicting definitions. It talks about the eyes and ears, but I have found actually through the internet, looking at Greek translations, because I'm of Greek heritage and I speak Greek. Now, modern Greek is not the same as Koine Greek, but when I read Koine Greek, I can understand, I'd say, over 50% of it. Sure. So there's still a good link.
Yeah.
Well, so I was looking at where it said the eyes and ears and looking at the Greek. And for ears, for ota, which is the word for ears, I kept having this nagging suspicion that it could mean everything. So if the soon-to-be Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitus saw the eyes and everything, well, that's indicating everything on the cloth. So I asked my mom, who's a native Greek, and she's like, no, you're confusing it with some other word. And I said, no, but I just have this nagging suspicion in the back of my head that it can mean, maybe it's some archaic term that can mean everything. And so I get on Google and I start looking at different translations. And I kept seeing when I just put in the word ota, where it just said ears. Now, I had also seen in an article, in a Shroud paper by Professor Dan Scavone, who's a Shroud expert.
Yeah.
And he had, in the text of the paper, he had written ota spelled with, it was an omega, I believe.
Okay.
But in a footnote where he also referenced the Greek text, it was spelled with an omicron. So at first I was thinking, oh, this is just a typographical error. But then I was like, well, maybe it's not.
Right.
So as a lawyer, I'm always hunting down loose, trying to tie up loose strings, and I'm going down rabbit trails, because that's a lot of times where you find the great stuff.
Right.
So I was wondering if, with the spelling, because in in the Greek alphabet, you have, sorry, that's my dog. You have two different letters for O, Omicron and Omega. So I was wondering if the meaning could possibly change if it was an Omicron. Well, when I was looking online, the translations were not showing anything for Omicron. But for Ota, it's with an Omega, it was showing ears. But then I came across this thing where you can do translations where you can type in whole sentences. So I type in the whole sentence in Greek with an Omicron, and lo and behold, it said the eyes and everything. I was like, holy mackerel.
Wow.
And I mean, I was just stunned. So then I was like, is this a fluke? You know, I'm a lawyer. I'm skeptical about that. So I find another type of online translator thing where I could put in the whole sentence. And then I got a definition of the eyes and all. Hold on. Let me see if I can get it quiet.
Yeah.
All right.
How do I pause?
I'll just press mute, I think.
Okay.
Here, I can mute you. There you
go. Well,
go ahead.
Guessing her dog.
Yeah,
I think the first thing to start with, you asked what is the shroud. So let's start with that first.
Sure.
So basically, it's a purported burial cloth of Jesus Christ. It has images on it that correspond to the treatment that Jesus got in the Gospels. It's a naked guy. He's got various wounds and bloodstains on him. It looks like he's been scourged and crucified. He's got wounds in his wrists and on his ankle feet. So that's what it is. It's basically purported to be Jesus's burial shroud. And what's interesting is that when it comes to the images in 1978, and we'll get into this in more detail, it was kind of studied, and they have these very unique set of physical and chemical properties or attributes that make the images remarkable. So most Christians like it, like myself and Teddy, because, oh my goodness, here's actual empirical evidence suggesting that a miracle of God has taken place that authenticates Christianity. So that's kind of what the shroud is. In terms of just addressing the history in a nutshell, so I kind of like Teddy. So here's my unique answer. In terms of the history thing, I'm kind of a weirdo in that I don't actually care about linking the shroud to the historical Jesus. Even if it's a medieval thing, I don't really care. It's as long as we can still prove that the images are probably miraculous, then that's good enough. God can do a miracle in the medieval times, today or whenever. So I'm kind of unique on that front. But that said, I do believe that the shroud did historically go back to Jesus, and I think the evidence is good on a balance of probabilities. So like Teddy, I think I would kind of link it with the image of Edessa. I know there's another thesis, like the image of Christ in Sicilia by the shroud historian Jack Markwart, which is might be another historical hypothesis. Again, these are all speculative in terms of what the shroud is and that sort of thing, but I think that we do have good evidence suggesting the shroud dates prior to the medieval times. So I would link the Shroud of Turin with something called the Sudarium of Oviedo, for example. And this is the purported head cloth that covered Jesus. It has bloodstains on it. And forensically, some of the bloodstains seem to correspond to some of the bloodstains and body fluids seen on the Shroud of Turin. And in this way, we can link the two. And we know for a fact that the Sudarium has a much older provenance than the medieval times or something. So, in a nutshell, that's kind of my take. Is that I believe that we can argue that the shroud probably covered Jesus, but even if we can't, even if it's medieval, who cares? We can still prove it's a miracle.
Right on. And look at that, the host with the most.
Heretic himself.
The heretic himself. Welcome back from the DMV, brother. David, you stuck?
Huh.
I think David.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say you were a heretic. I didn't mean
Whenever you said he was a heretic, his brain just exploded.
It seems like
Teddy,
you can't hear us.
Yeah, it does seem like that. Teddy, did you want to finish your thought?
Oh, yes. So I then checked another online translator where I can put in a whole sentence or paragraph, whatever. But I typed in the sentence, and this time it said for that tail end important part of that sentence, it said the eyes and everything. And so I'm like, so the O, for some reason, when I would type it with an omega, it would say ears. But I'm like, why is it saying everything or all, meaning the same thing, with that? Now, the importance of that is because on the very second day of the image of Edessa's being in Constantinople, Gregory Referendarius gave his famous sermon, and he spoke about the image of Edessa, and he had seen it. So we have a firsthand account from his sermon. No, this is a copy of his sermon, not the original, because these manuscripts don't survive that long, so it's copies of copies. But in it, he describes the side wound, seeing the blood in the side wound. Now, what's relevant about that? Why is that huge? Because there is a big debate as to whether the image of Edessa, which is also sometimes known as the Mandelion, whether that is just like a square piece of cloth that is just the face of Christ, or whether it's the whole body. Now, the reason what it is it's confusion, because we can see through fold marks on the shroud, because remember, it's like a 14-foot long by 3 or something inches foot long cloth. It was folded. Now, and we can see the fold marks on the shroud. And these fold marks correlate with it being to where you can fold it in a way to where you see the face right in the middle, and then that would be put in a reliquary. And so when they held up this reliquary with the folded cloth on the inside, what do people see? They see a square piece of cloth with the face on it. And so then the tradition came about, this thing was just the square, but no, they're not seeing everything behind it. But again, we have the second day after the image of Edessa, where Gregory Referendarius, you can't see a side wound in a cloth that's just the face. And there's a ton of evidence. And it's an area that's not really looked into very much. But so that's one of the reasons why I've been fascinated, because as criminal defense, the provenance, the chain of evidence is important. But just like Dale said, it's not the end all be all, because let's take with a criminal case. Let's say a murder happened, and then the police a year later find the gun that was used to murder somebody in a river. Well, you know what? You don't have to have, in order to convict somebody, a chain of evidence saying, okay, from the time of the murder that the gun was used, every single little detail that the murderer did with the gun to show how exactly it got into the river. If you can show that what's in the river, by whatever evidence, is the thing that caused the death of the person, then that's all you really need. So even though there are some gaps in the history of the shroud, I say, so what? And so long as we can see that what is described, and that we know in the Gospels, we've got these cloths, and we see with the shroud and the sudarium, and we see consistency, and we keep hearing about this image, because see, that's the thing. There's this talk all through history of this cloth that is not made by human hands. And so then you say, well, that sounds a bit suspect. But you know what? To this day, even with all of the modern technology, they cannot replicate all of these very curious features about the
Yeah.
shroud.
That is,
So
that is awesome, because I,
it
in
is.
doing the research on, on this topic with the Odessa,
Mhm.
cloth, with it being just the face, right? That we see a lot. It's interesting that you bring up that there's actual fold marks that would just display
Mhm.
the face, and that would be, I think, an excellent
Isn't that?
rebuttal for that. Yeah, go ahead.
Mhm.
Yeah, I was just, if I can just jump in, one thing about, so Dr. John Jackson has proven scientifically these fold marks, and one thing that's interesting about the fold marks is this is also suggestive perhaps of the dates, because there was a study, let me just back in 2002, a couple of Shroud researchers, Aldo Garashi and Michelle Salcido. Sorry, I'm horrible with names, but they actually presented a paper whereby they can tell there's water stains on the shroud,
Hmm.
and they can tell that, okay, based on these water stains, it would have had to have been folded into a certain configuration at one point, where it could have precisely fit into an ancient jar, a jar that wouldn't have been around in medieval period. So that's perhaps suggestive of an earlier provenance based on these fold patterns.
Wow, Josh, you got anything you want to ask or add?
I mean, it's kind of got my wheels turning in terms of like you said, the idea of linking evidence to the original event rather than trying to find every link between now and the event, finding those things that are relevant enough to say, yeah, it's the gun, this was the gun that killed them. We have the gun, we have the event, we have the link of the gun to the person who used it. This is
Yeah,
sufficient. I don't need every footstep that he made in order to get it in the river. I don't need the current of the river and why the gun has this rust mark or that rust mark. Those things are just additives to explain, but they're not actually what traces back from here to there.
sure.
And so I'm kind of at, pun not intended, what's the smoking gun for you
Mhm.
on the shroud itself? Which is it, a particular style of marking? Is it the fact that you can verify this man was scourged and crucified? Was it is it kind of an accumulation of several things? Because you sound very convinced, and you're explaining it in a way that's very lawyer-esque, right? And so I'm kind of, for you, what is that smoking gun? What is the thing? What is it that you pulled out of the river that you're like, aha?
It is well, in law, a lot of times people think that the best evidence is direct evidence or eyewitness testimony, and actually that's not true. Eyewitness testimony can be replete with errors. We see rape victims that ended up horribly misidentifying somebody, even though they were so close
Sure.
to them, and DNA evidence proves that they had to be wrong, and yet they're so certain they're right. Sometimes the strongest cases can be made circumstantially, where and as we describe what circumstantial evidence is, in order to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt, it is where you draw all of this different evidence, but it has to weave a web that is so tight where there's no reasonable doubt. So a
Right.
little bit here, a little bit there. So with the shroud, I don't know that to me, it is just like we say in the law, it's the body of evidence. It's putting everything together. And one of the things, the most wonderful piece of advice that I'd ever heard said concerning the shroud, and it was Dr. Alan Adler, who was the blood expert, who was part of the STIRT team. He said, a lot of times, and he was specifically talking about blood, but actually what he said is perfectly applicable to the shroud in general. You cannot, okay, so we've got a mountain of evidence supporting the shroud's authenticity. you cannot, no, I mean, nothing will be 100%. That's just not how anything in the world works. The only thing that we can know 100% is like what Rene Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, consciousness.
Right.
Everything, there's no 100%, and people are chasing a dream if they think you can get that. So we're looking at probabilities and then compelling probabilities. So so the thing is that when you see a mountain of evidence, sure, you're always going to be able to poke some sort of little hole in anything. So it doesn't count when you have a mountain of evidence and you poke a little hole here and a little hole there and a little hole there.
Right.
Yet that little hole really doesn't amount to anything. And you say, oh, well, you've got nothing. No, because one has to account for the evidence that actually exists as a whole, pointing to authenticity. You have to explain away how one thing can all point to something being true. Because I can assure you that if you wanted to try to make a case that I'm Wonder Woman, you're not going to be able to do it. I mean, where's your evidence?
Let's make a part 2.
It's
we'll do
the
that
hair.
So I might say, well, I got brown hair like Linda Carter, and you're going to say, but you don't have this, but you're going to poke a lot of holes in that. But you're going to say, well, you don't have the special bracelet or whatever. But so, anybody that thinks that you can just come up with a mountain of evidence that's compelling to prove, and it's backed up with science and history to prove a point, then let's see you do it.
Yeah.
Because, there's this thing called the ring of truth. And so people, when they see a mountain of evidence and they try to do these little ad hoc attacks, like, oh, well, here's a little problem here, here's a little problem there. No, you've got to explain away all of these things pointing in one direction in order, and if you want to try to disprove something.
Right. And more so than none, the people that are poking those little holes in there already are coming with the presupposition of a skeptic anyway.
Yeah, and it's okay to be skeptical, and I'm fine. I'm a skeptic myself. When I hear things, that's why I wanted to read a book on the Shroud. Even at age 15, I wasn't just going to accept it whole cloth.
Sure.
I wanted to learn about it, but when you hear, and these aren't just nobodies who were working on this. We had. There were scientists, chemists from Los Alamos National Laboratory, where they make the nuclear bombs for the government. I mean, and Sandia Laboratories. I mean, we're talking top-notch people, and a blood expert that was a professor, Dr. Alan Adler. I mean, we're not talking about Joe Blow next door that was trying to do an experiment and is making unsubstantiated claims. So it's very compelling, but it's not just one thing. You have to have that whole body of evidence, because you can prove all of the chemistry and the science, but if you don't have identity, then what do you have? Then it could be just some curious phenomena of some crucifixion victim. How do you link it to Christ? But it can be linked to Christ.
Right.
So identity is a big deal.
Amen. And we'll get into the science and how exactly the Shroud links to Christ. I do want to bring up, because you mentioned the Gospels and their use of Sindone with the sheet. I want to touch on John and listening to the debate that you had with Hugh on Seekers and Skeptics. He had mentioned this, or one of them mentioned it in the beginning, but it really didn't get touched on since that wasn't the topic of the debate. But I do want to read for our listeners John 19 and John 20, and then get your guys' thoughts on this. So John 19:38. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. and Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took away his body. Nicodemus also, who earlier had come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds in weight. So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloths with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. And then in John 20, verses 6-7, then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths, plural, lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus's head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. And the question I have is, how can the Shroud of Turin be what John is describing in chapters 19 and 20 of his gospel, given that the shroud is a single unit?
Well, with the shroud, you've got to remember we've got the long strip of linen that's like 3 by 14 in terms of size, but you also have there's evidence, and it's of course totally common. Even my mom, who's born in Greece, she's even seen, because they don't have a whole lot of space to bury people. So after a year, once the body has been reduced to a skeleton, they take the bones out and put it in a bone box, where it takes up less space. But she's even seen, even in modern Greece, where they use these chin straps to or to hold the jaw shut so that the mouth isn't gaping open. So it was a custom, and I'm sure probably still is among certain probably Orthodox Jews, where they put the chin band. There's evidence in the images of the shroud, because we don't see ears
Right.
on the shroud.
Right.
And that was actually one of the interesting things with the Ota issue that first drew my attention. I was like, how could have seen ears? Because you don't see ears on the shroud. So that's kind of what spiraled my curiosity, and I then investigated it. But
Sure.
so in John we have, and let me say something else too. We're dealing with the English translations. To really get down to business, you've got to go to the original Greek.
Right.
Now, in John 19, what is it, 40, the original Greek, the word that they use, because in some translations, some English translations, they say that he took Jesus's body and wrapped it with aromatic spices. Now, some people don't use wrapped. Some people use tied. And my knowledge of Greek was saying, wait a minute, the word evisan is never tied. It's the other word that the synoptic gospels use, enthylixon. And we use that word even now, like if you're wrapping a Christmas present, you're going, not delixis, the present. So you've got a situation to where textual criticism is extremely important, going back to the original Greek, because some of these translations in different Bibles can get very willy-nilly. So first of all, in John, it's where some say wrapped. The Greek word is tied or bound.
Right.
But then they use the word orthonia. Now, there was the issue of whether that is a singular word or plural. And it seems from what I am seeing that word is it's still not quite resolved whether it's singular or plural.
Okay.
I was thinking that it was singular. Trying to remember if Hugh, we were trying to discuss this recently.
Okay.
And but I think it's going to boil down to a textual critic getting in and weighing in. And I actually contacted one who works at a seminary.
Right.
And he's a younger fellow. He's not one of the established ones.
Sure.
Asking for his help, and he didn't have the time of day for it. So.
Right. It's interesting that you bring that up because in the translation, the SBL translation of the Greek New Testament, they actually translate it as a plural, hathani ois. And so I thought that was interesting. But yeah, I'll dive into more research on that, whether it is actually supposed to be translated as a plural or a singular. That's interesting.
Teddy, who did you reach out to?
Peter Gurry, who wrote, a great book, and he was saying that his schedule didn't allow for him to. And I'm like, you're a textual critic, I asked a number of questions, but given his field, I wouldn't think it would have required that much effort. But
why don't you give me exactly what you want to ask them, and I'll pass it on to my friend that's a text critic.
Okay, I will.
Okay.
That'd be good.
Because I think, but I can argue it either way. So let's just even say if you say edesan afto othonis, well, in order to bind or to tie the big cloth, you need the smaller cloth. So then that creates a plural. So I don't think that either way that's problematic. But then when you get to in John 20, it talks about in Greek kimena ta othonia. Now some people say laying down, that the cloth was laying down. Now I started getting curious about that because, for example, like if you lay down to go to sleep, the word is connected to that nakimithis, to go and recline to sleep. And it's like, well, when you die, you're being put to rest, you're laying down. So then I started wondering if kimenata othonia, that he lepi kimenata othonia, that he sees the cloths lying down, or is it? And no, there have been other translations that use burial cloth here instead of cloths lying down. And I think, to me, that really can make sense because he's seeing, because it's describing the cloth, that it's for the burial. And then my dog. Excuse me 1 second.
All right. Oh, she's still.
Pick back up, Dale.
So,
I can pick it back up from here for a second.
You want to pick? Okay, yeah. Yeah. So obviously, I saw Teddy's post on the SSG kind of thing. One thing. So there's this issue of multiple cloths, and I guess to kind of simplify it, Teddy, you're probably aware of Dr. John Jackson finding that strip on the cloth. It's been ripped. It was a stripped, and they say it was used to bind the body. So this was one of the 4 minimal cloths that would have been used. And then it was sewn back onto the shroud itself. So if I'm able to share my screen, I can show like a video image of it for like a couple minutes or something. I don't know if that'll be helpful, but yeah, let me see if share screen.
Should just say share. Yeah, it's pretty easy.
Okay, share. Okay, so you have to just share everything, I guess.
Yeah, and then you can upload to the specific screen there. I'll add it to the stream.
Yep.
There you go.
Yeah, you got it.
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, we'll just play it for like a couple minutes. You can see how it.
Is the Gospel of John. He mentions the face cloth, but he also mentions burial cloths in the plural. That must include the shroud that wrapped the corpse. But the plural indicates that there was yet another cloth, and that has puzzled New Testament scholars. Well, Jackson believes he has identified the other cloth in the shroud itself, in a strip of cloth sewn along one side.
This is a transmitted image. It's a transmitted light image. It's an absorption image. And the shroud is being held up.
Jackson owns this backlit image of the shroud taken in 1978. and it shows clearly that the bands of discoloration from the weaving go right through the seam from the main cloth to the strip.
Oh, wow.
It was part of the original cloth, then torn off and then re-sewn back on again. Could this side strip be the missing cloth alluded to in John's book?
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Dale, do you have any follow-up on that, or?
Yeah.
Here's the side strip on the shroud, right?
So I guess you guys get. Can you guys still hear me, or?
Yeah,
we can hear.
yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So hopefully you guys saw that. Was that helpful? Like that, I think that's excellent evidence that kind of addresses this issue that you guys are raising.
No, absolutely. I think it's, yeah, that addressed my concerns. Josh, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
I mean, I had never seen the detail of the fact that there was a strip sewn along the entire side of the thing.
Right.
I think that's probably, for me, that would be something along the lines of a smoking gun, right? Like I think that the idea that there was multiple pieces of cloth recorded in the gospel, and yet we don't have multiple pieces of cloth in front of us. It's like, well, technically that's because they've been mended. I think that's pretty compelling.
Yeah.
I had never seen that before or noticed it necessarily. But I think that that's actually something that's really worth knowing as an addition to what it is you guys are describing, and saying that, okay, well, you know, there's a biblical, I don't know about objection, but maybe a question about multiple versus singular. And it's like you said, if there's a large cloth and it needs to be wrapped and it's wrapped tightly, and then you have the necessity of the jaw not falling, the mandible not falling from the skull, it's like, how do you keep that? It's like a secondary wrap around the head
And
around
likely
the neck.
hands too being bound.
Right, exactly.
And
And doing the way that all of the preparation that there was actually part of the video where there was the folding preparation thing going on. I thought that was also really interesting to watch. But as far as I could see, it seems pretty compelling to say it used to be two pieces. That, okay, one piece, a piece cut off, made two pieces at least, and then re-sewn on to make a mended one piece.
Yeah.
Really kind of encapsulates the objection and the inquiry all into one thing, and say, yeah, this accounts for that. So I think that that was really useful. Thanks.
You know, I'm wondering also too, with the, because John gives, you know, he says the face cloth, which was lying by itself, right? I'm wondering if that strip, because you said, you had mentioned, Teddy, that, you know, it goes around the jawline. Could that long strip be that thing that tied, you know, Jesus's jaw?
I think that was possibly with it. But if you go back to John, it talks about how, remember, John first goes in, and the word is that parakipsas, which means kind of like to duck in to the tomb, to peek in. So he wouldn't have had the best look at everything. He just probably saw quickly what was most obvious, which was the biggest, which is the shroud. But then when Peter goes all the way into the tomb, and it's Peter that sees both the Othonia Kimena, which can either be translated as the cloths lying there or the burial cloths. Either way, it works.
Sure.
And separately, the Sudarian. Now, a Sudarian, it means sweat cloth. Now, and that would be distinguishable, I think, from just a strip. I would think of a sweat cloth as being more like a bandana. But that's precisely, even today, let's say if somebody dies, you know, like on a motorcycle on the street, what's the first thing that people will usually do? They'll cover the face.
Right.
And so that's what the Sudarium, all the evidence points to the Sudarium of Oviedo in Oviedo, Spain, because there are some very interesting correspondences between the way the bloodstains are on that cloth. Now, there's no image on that cloth, but the way the bloodstains are on that cloth, there's a striking correspondence, how it fits in with the bloodstains on that we see on the face of the man's image on the shroud.
Yeah.
And so I believe that, and most shroud scholars believe that when Joseph of Arimathea brought Christ down from the cross, they put this face cloth on him. But now, as Jews would do, the blood is sacred. So then that blood has to be buried with the body to keep the blood together, the life's blood. So I'm certain that they would have kept that cloth and buried it with them. And I'm totally confident beyond a reasonable doubt that that's precisely what is referred to as the sudarium that is separate. And it would make sense that they would have, you'd have the cloth in one place where Jesus is buried in, but then they and it says rolled, that it was rolled, and they tucked away the face cloth and put it in a spot there. But because I think John just peeked in,
Sure,
he didn't see everything.
sure.
So I don't find, so some people try to see John as being very different. No, and something else that a lot of people don't notice, and that is that in Luke, in Luke 24:12, again, it talks about, see, everybody thinks that, or most people, that it's only John that mentions orthonia, the word orthonia in the Greek. Luke mentions it too, but it's not in the spot where John says. But when Luke mentions it, it's he says that John, peeked in and he saw the orthonia hykimena, which is it burial cloth or just the orthonia that are laying down. But he uses it too, so it's not like John is just some outlier. And John may have just been a little bit different in the description, in that earlier when he talks about them wrapping the body, he may have just been more descriptive and added more details that it's strips, meaning to account for the strips that are binding the larger cloth.
Sure, absolutely. It makes sense. It absolutely makes sense. Dale, did you have any follow-up?
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify something that, so like Teddy was mentioning the sudarium. So there's not just two cloths. There's the shroud, the strip. There could be the chin strap that was separate, and there's also that sudarium. So there's at least 3 or 4. Gary Habermas thinks that there's 4 kind of thing. The chin strap is separate from the other strap kind of thing. So just wanted to clarify that for people.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, Josh, before we get into the science, I know Dale had you wanted to talk about the methodology of the science behind the shroud. Did you have anything before we transition, or David?
I was gonna just for clarity ask, you said that the piece that was referenced specifically as a facial cloth is something that you think was used temporarily in the transport of the body and was buried with the body, but not part of the wrapping burial of the body. Am I still following? Okay. Oh, you're muted.
Teddy, you're muted.
There you go.
Is that for Dale or for me? I didn't.
Well, it was. I guess it was for you, because you had mentioned specifically that this was a separate piece, and that you had considered it to be something that was probably used ceremonially as the covering of the face from when they took him down from the cross and transported his body from that location into the actual gravesite. And then from there, they would wrap the body in a more formal cloth, and that other cloth would then be removed, but set off to the side and buried with him, because as in Deuteronomy, the life is in the blood, and so forth. So having the blood be in the burial place makes sense to me. But I was confused as to whether, because you said there wasn't a face imprint on it, but that there was blood stains that corresponded. So it's like you're saying that was used temporarily to cover his face for transport, but not used permanently for the burial, right?
And
that's why it would be present, but also separate. Correct.
And the way that we can have complete confidence that he was not buried with that cloth is because it doesn't have the image on it. Because if that if the sudarium was over Jesus's face during as he was being wrapped up in the larger shroud, then the facial image would only, well, I guess one could argue that the radiation or whatever energy could have seeped through
Right.
the sudarium into the larger cloth. Hold on one minute. Sorry about my dog. 1 minute.
It's okay. Dale?
Well, while she's doing that, if you want, I can show like a clip again from that BBC thing, so you can kind of see what we're talking about in terms of the bloodstains. Do you guys are the hosts. Would you want to see that?
Yeah, please
I'd
do.
be interested.
Very.
Let me share again.
And just out of curiosity, because I know I asked you, Dale, but Teddy, what's your background as far as what church you're associated with? Are you a Protestant as well?
I am Greek Orthodox. That's what I grew
There you go, Josh.
into.
There you go.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
No, I was saying because the reason I was asking is because recently I've been investigating the Eastern Church a lot more, and I've come to be really interested in the idea of relics and icons and so forth, and was going to later on ask about the implications spiritually of finding something like this intact, and knowing that not only historically or tangibly having some sort of evidence of the miraculous, but also finding in it what implication it has for our spiritual practices, in knowing that God would leave something like this behind, and what's its significance. So just kind of maybe roll that around in the back of your head for later.
I would say though that even though I grew up Greek Orthodox, growing up I went to I was off and on sometimes in private schools, church schools. So I've also had exposure to Lutheran as a child, going to chapel and Bible class at school, as well as Baptist. And I'm not necessarily wedded.
That explains it.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily wedded to the idea of everything that the Orthodox Church has to say is correct. For example, I don't believe in infant baptism. I don't think it's necessarily wrong or horrible to do it, but I don't think that that's the purpose of it. So, I'm an independent thinker, and there are things with the Protestant doctrines, and so I'm just kind of like, I just take it as I see it and think about it, and I think that's the best way to approach these issues. Not just because I'm born into this church, I have to toe the line. So.
Right. Dale, if you want to go ahead and play your video now.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I just want to give you guys kind of a visual image of what we're talking about with the sudarium, this head cloth.
Yeah.
Mark Guskin, an expert on the Sudarium of Oviedo in Spain. His evidence could push the date of the Turin Shroud back another 700 years to the 5th century. This is an identical copy of the Sudarium. Its purpose was to trap blood escaping from the corpse as it was taken away for burial. Guskin believes he's identified significant evidence linking the Sudarium to the Shroud of Turin. Guskin already knew that the shroud has real blood. It belongs to the rare group AB. There are also traces of blood shed in life and blood shed in death. And finally, there are the unmistakable traces of blood from a crown of thorns on the front of the head and the back. Guskin believes all three blood features can be found on the Sudarium.
The first is the blood group, which is a relatively rare blood group on the planet. It's the blood group AB, and it's the same blood group of human blood on both cloths. Then there's also the differentiation between lifeblood, in other words, blood shed in life, and post-mortem blood, which can be clearly differentiated. And again, that coincides on both cloths. And that brings us to, for me, clinches the whole matter of the cloths being used on the same body. Now, this was blood shed in life, while the man in question was still alive. Now, this blood comes from wounds that were made by some kind of sharp object piercing the skin in this area of the nape of the neck. Okay, perfectly compatible with what has been called since then crown of thorns. Okay, now if we look at this, we have exactly the same stains in the same area on the Shroud of Turin. Now, the actual shape of the stains, if you do an overlay of the two, well, the actual shape, the way the blood flowed coincides on both cloths.
So what you're saying is not only the blood types that are the same, the actual patterns of the blood on both cloths can be matched.
That's right. That's exactly so.
Awesome. So yeah, I think that gives you guys an idea of what is the claim from some pro shroud experts like Mark Guskin here and stuff. So
right on, man. Thank you so much for that, Dell. So go ahead, if you guys want to, let's go ahead and transition into the science of this, Dell. I know you said you wanted to talk about the methodology of it, so take it away, brother.
Yeah, so not so much the methodology of the science, because the CERP scientists followed the scientific method proper type thing, but method of, okay, well, what do we do with the science, right? So the science establishes we've got certain features, physical and chemical features or properties of the images on the shroud in terms of the body images and the bloodstain images. But so what? How do we get a miracle out of that? So in the first place, I've invented an approach, kind of like Gary Habermas invented his minimal facts approach. I have what I call the minimal relevant features approach. So I only use physical or chemical properties that have been strongly scientifically proven beyond reasonable doubt. Both skeptic and pro-shroud people all accept it. And it also shares scholarly consensus. Again, I'm friend. Well, Teddy and I are. Well, I'm friends with Hugh Ferry, the most famous shroud skeptic in my opinion, kind of thing, and he would agree with all these facts. But then we say, so what? How do we interpret that? How do we say that it's a miracle? And philosophers have various ways. So number one, you've got to prove the event happens. Number two, you've got to prove that event is somehow improbable or extraordinary relative to natural law in some way. And then thirdly, you've got to show it takes place at, as Mike Licona would say, a context charged with religious significance. So my sort of approach in studying the shroud, in terms of the other two criteria, so with the first criteria, proving the events, I explained I only use these minimal relevant features. How do I prove that the shroud is extraordinary? And just in a nutshell, I think that there are three different types of arguments. So number one, you can argue mechanistically, showing that naturalistic mechanisms are improbable to explain the bloodstains and separately the body images. You can separate those out as two separate arguments. Or you can show that it's unique. And this kind of speaks to what you were saying before Teddy came. It's not just that the shroud's unique, but it's unique despite there having been a sufficient opportunity for the shroud images to have been duplicated in a naturalistic context or something like that. And on that front with the shroud, we've got ample evidence, because not only do we have natural opportunities, we've lost a lot, but we do have a handful of bandages and linen garments and stuff associated with bodies where you might say, well, there's been a sufficient natural opportunity for at least one other thing that's similar to what we have with the shroud. But even more importantly, we have artificial opportunities. And this is the clincher for me. We have dozens and dozens of laboratory and field experiments trying to duplicate the shroud's images. All of these have failed to date, despite scientists knowing in advance what they have to get and understanding what they're aiming for. They still fail miserably. And then the third way, I guess, is you can argue circumstantially through, the circumstances are extraordinary in some way. And then finally, obviously, is the last part, the religious context. And that's where you argue that the shroud, it's clearly meant to depict Jesus, the Jesus of the Gospels and that sort of thing. And if the images are so extraordinary in this way, I argue that it's serving to attest to the truth of Christianity. And once I fulfill these things, these correspond to William Dembski's specified complexity, and we can infer intelligent design. And given the religious context, intelligent divine design for the purpose. So he created these extraordinary images for the purpose of saying Christianity is true. Jesus died and rose from the dead. So in terms of, that's my methodology of how I take the scientific data and assess it and turn it into God did this.
Right on, Dale. I really appreciate that. Guys, I have got to go. I hate it. It was a pleasure meeting you, Teddy. It was
Pleasure
Dale.
meeting you too.
It's always been fun, but this conversation will continue. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my co-host, Josh. He'll lead the discussion with David. And again, thank you so much, David, for having me do this. It was so much fun. I promise, I'll put it like this.
Sorry for taking so long. I didn't know.
No, you're good. You are good, brother. But I will say this, kind of wrapping up. I absolutely love this topic. You all have inspired me to do more research into this, and I am so excited to actually dive into that. David and I have a debate on the 24th, and as soon as that gets wrapped up, I will be interested in reading books. Teddy, I think Dale said you had a book coming out about this. Is that?
Well, I'm working on it.
Okay.
It's probably going to be out in about a year and a half.
Okay, keep in touch and let me know whenever that comes out. I'd love to read it. But y'all, I am going to go. Thank you so much. Josh, you can have it.
Thank you.
All right. See ya.
Well, thanks for hanging out, Tyler. And this has definitely been
as you see, Tyler's easily amused, right?
Yeah, no, this has definitely been a cool topic change up for me because like I said, my main focus of study is not usually on certain things like the Shroud or necessarily any of the historical background stuff of tangible objects that trace back to something like. And it's really interesting too because as a Christian, we all have this draw into seeing Christ as the person of God, but this really draws out for me in some sense more tangibly a connection to his humanity. In a way that's really, like, for me, it feels more significant to think about this as a drawing back to him being fully man than it is thinking about it as like verification for a historical claim or something that tangibly expresses the reality of miracles. I've seen miracles in my own life enough that I don't doubt that, but I can say that the real importance and implication for me drawing from what you guys have said so far is that this really hammers home to me that Jesus's incarnation is not only true in the most ultimate sense, it's also fact in the most base sense. That it's something where it's almost impossible to think about the religious implications and the historical implications in the same sentence for me, because it's like there's such a dissonance there to think about, God as history necessarily. God is involved in history, but now God is the centerpiece of history. And I think that for me, that's the most important part of what you guys are talking about, is if all of this is true, then what it says to me is beyond the miracle that Jesus is in fact the man. You know what I mean? I'm curious as to where you guys place this in terms of your, like, does this impact the way that you look at history at large? Is this something that impacts the way that you guys think about church tradition and things like that? Is this something that kind of draws you into that circle further, or is this something that's purely like the scientific and historical significance of the thing? Do you understand what I'm asking?
With me, it's not quite any of those things. What it is, and it's something that I encourage. I want more people in the world to learn about the Shroud, because it is one thing. I didn't need the Shroud to be a Christian and to believe in God. I've always believed in God. I believed in God at the time I learned about the Shroud. But when you take something just on faith and on the arguments that even the best apologists make, you can't, in my assessment, in terms of evidence, you can't quite get it to proof beyond a reasonable doubt. You can get it to compelling enough proof to where, kind of like with Pascal's wager, yeah, and even beyond that, but you can't quite get it to proof beyond a reasonable doubt like what you would do in a criminal trial. But the shroud
So that's
evidence
sorry.
brings it, I am telling you, it brings it to that. It brings evidence of the supernatural to where, and I tell you this, and I stake my credibility on this, it becomes unreasonable to not believe that God in a supernatural realm exists. And that's so powerful. And I think it's so unfortunate that we have so many of these phenomenal apologists that are missing out on the pièce de résistance in terms of evidence that takes their whole argument to a whole other level, to where you can prove a miracle by the standard of that atheist David Hume, to where he said that, to prove a miracle, you've got to show that it basically is unreasonable to think anything else other than what the miracle seeks to establish is true. And when you put the shroud evidence up with all of the other apologetical arguments, as well as the secular corresponding concurrent accounts of Christ, one of the things that I've been researching recently has been about secular accounts of the darkness at crucifixion. Now, some people were, even back then, they were trying to say it was an eclipse. But you know what?
Right.
At the time of Passover, the way the things are with the sun and the moon, it is impossible to have an eclipse. And
let alone one that lasts for 3 hours.
Yes. And people were testifying to secular people just, scrambling, scurrying to come up with a natural explanation. It's nonsensical for a supernatural event. And so I like bringing in science and history and argumentation and reason and logic all together. They converge and they create this body of evidence that makes it indisputable to rational, intellectually honest people. It makes it indisputable that the Christian God exists. And I stake every bit of credibility I have on that. And the evidence is there, and all it takes is for people to look. But the Bible says that there are people that will have eyes that cannot see and that have ears that cannot hear. And that is, willful ignorance. So, but so to me, it's the body of evidence.
What about you, Dale? How would you answer that question? Because it sounds like she's basically saying the opposite, that this for me is impactful toward recognizing the sharing I have with humanity, with Christ. But it sounds like to you, it's more so the introduction of something that makes this concrete reality out of the supernatural and God's intervention, right? And that's the bigger bomb that drops there, is that God.
And if I can,
yeah, it's. Oh. Teddy's trying to. So I'll answer quickly. I know Teddy wants to respond again, but so in a nutshell, yes, I think that you're right. For me, the significance of the shroud is mostly, look, it provides concrete evidence on a balance of probabilities that this is true. And then once you get that, the theological significance comes in, and my Lord and Savior died and rose from the dead for me, and this is proof of the incarnation. He was here in the flesh. But primarily, my concern when I was studying it at first is, look, this is evidence that says this is true, strictly. But yeah, Teddy, I know you want to come back quickly. I think we should get into what are the actual scientific facts related to it after. But just, did I hear you correctly, Teddy? So you no longer think the shroud is proven beyond reasonable doubt? Because I know at one time you
oh
did.
no, of course I No, I absolutely think that the shroud is
Okay.
the burial cloth of Christ, and that it is a miracle that evidences the miracle of the resurrection. But what I was going to say, just to get back to what Joshua was saying, so the shroud initially for me, it's all about evidence of just indisputable proof beyond a reasonable doubt that God exists. But then, as I have been getting into the deep dives of research, and when you start looking at these details, honestly, when you start researching the shroud in a serious way, you go to look up, to research one thing, and 5 new things pop up. It normally, the more you research something, you get more answers. There is such a complexity, and it just constantly grows. It is this huge mystery, but as you start to realize and understand the great truth of what it is, and that you are looking at the image of God, and you can actually have a good idea of what the face of God incarnate looks like, and you can gaze at it. That's such an amazing thing. And when you read about the bloodstains, and when you read about details from forensic pathologists as to what Christ must have felt like on that cross, that brings a closeness to our Savior that I do not believe can be achieved through faith alone. It brings a radical closeness to God. And that has been the most incredible thing that I can say about my research. That radical closeness, far more than, because it's one thing when you are confident about something, it's another thing. I don't have faith anymore in God. I have knowledge of God. I have
Well,
certainty
Teddy, you know that
of
anything
his
not of
knowledge.
faith is sin. So we guess that you're living in sin then, because no,
But
anything
God
not of faith
said
is sin. Okay,
that,
come on, Teddy.
At least she's not a heretic like you, David.
Oh yeah. Oh,
God
very
said
good.
that we have
You
to
got
be
me,
able
coach.
to
It's okay,
provide
bro.
a defense for our faith. So he doesn't
Gotcha.
expect it to be
I'm teasing you, Teddy.
Well, so to hasten back to what Dale was talking about, let's kind of transition into the more tangible evidence-based portions of this. What exactly is the data that's been found that you guys are interpreting to be true or not true? We talked about the probability and ideas of how it is you inquire into a past event. You can't recreate it right now to say whether or not it's true. So there has to be something other than this yes or no. But what is it that you said you wanted to transition into? What's the science behind what it is we're looking at? And so what would be the most prominent piece of the data that kind of
Yeah. So
what is it that they're testing for when they're looking at it?
yeah. So this kind of relates to what I call those minimal relevant features, at least in my case, kind of thing, right? So I break it up into about 7 categories. So just I won't give all of them, but just to give some of the main ones, that are important. So the first one that was ever discovered was the photographic negativity. The images are photographic negative, or at the very least a quasi negative image. Also, very importantly, it has 3-dimensional information or topographic information. So when you plug it into a machine like a VP8 image analyzer or something, or a computer today, it represents 3D images. Some lesser known ones, though, for example, and these are really important when we're looking at what kind of mechanism could create these things. So the body image uniformity. So that means with the Shroud of Turin, the body image color, every individual fibril. So a fibril, there's about like 200 to 300 fibrils that make up an individual thread. These things are very, very tiny. They're smaller than the diameter of a human hair. Each of these are colored individually to the exact same intensity of color. They're uniform in terms, so one fiber isn't darker than another or lighter than another. So body image uniformity, obviously that's going to speak to mechanism, as I've shown. There's also body image superficiality. So the color, the body image color is only on the topmost fibrils, and there's three levels here. So on a fabric level, it's superficial. It just means the image doesn't show up on the back of the cloth. Who cares? That can happen naturalistically, right? But it's also superficial at the thread level, meaning only the top 2 to 3 fibrils, those things smaller than a human hair, are colored. Thirdly, it's superficial on the level of the fibril. Only the primary cell wall is colored. The color doesn't penetrate past that primary cell wall. That's remarkable. I mean, just think of something like painting, for example. It's not going to be superficial. Paint will drip down beyond, soak through beyond just that. So you can see why these features are relevant. There's other features. Another one that's not mentioned, but I think is one of the most important one, is that there are wrapping distortions on the shroud that have been mathematically proven by Dr. John Jackson in secular scientific peer-reviewed journals, so that the encodation method, whatever encoded the body images onto the shroud, had to travel in vertical straight line paths or curvilinear paths. So this definite radiation particles will travel in vertical straight lines. Some people have tried to say, well, electromagnetic, but it puts constraints on what kind of mechanisms could possibly encode in this straight line way. But yeah, there's other features. Maybe I'll turn it to Teddy. Are there any other features? I know you're really into the blood, so maybe.
Yes, with the blood evidence, but one other thing in terms of body image that I'd like to say, people have tried to replicate this. One theory was, maybe somebody got a hot statue, a statue, heated it up, put a cloth on it to get an imprint, like through a Maillard reaction darkness. Well, the problem with, it's a good try. The problem is that with the 3D nature of a statue, when you put the cloth on the sides, it's gonna go around. But then when that cloth straightens out, you're gonna have a distortion in the image. And so what that shows is that the image that is on the shroud was not gotten through a contact process, but through a type of projected on process. And
something from the inside pushing outward is what you're saying, rather than pressure being applied from the outside to conform something. This was something that was expressed outward.
I suppose it could be argued, whether energy came from outside in or inside out, but the evidence seems to indicate that it was from inside out, and that it was the process of the resurrection that created the energy that left it. But I'm convinced that the image on the shroud was a purposeful thing by God to give us proof. It's for the doubting Thomases. It's not like Jesus rejected doubting Thomas. And so I think it's an apologetic tool, but also for Christians, we can not only see the face of our Lord and our Savior, but we also see the sacrifice. We see the blood stains, and we can look at that. And it's, when you really look at that, and when you read about, especially with, it's not a crown of thorns, it was a cap, because they show the way the puncture wounds are on the back image, because it's a frontal and dorsal image on the shroud. When you look to see how high up they go, it wasn't just a little circlet that of thorns. It was a cap, and just when you see it, it's stunning. But when you look at the blood, so Paul Vignon and others have tried to replicate these blood stains, and you think, somebody could have just gotten some paint and brushed it on. No, doesn't work. It will not give you the blood stains that you see on the shroud. Because, for example, if you drop some blood onto a piece of linen, what's going to happen is the blood is going to follow the threads of the linen. They call it capillarity. And it's going to create almost like a star pattern, like an asterisk. It's not going to stay like in this perfect round way. It's going to travel across the threads. And then there's the issue of if you were trying to paint it, let's just even assume somehow that it didn't have that capillarity feature, which of course it does. But aside from that, if let's say you get a cup of blood and you dip your paintbrush in, well, it's not very long before that blood starts to coagulate. So how are you going to have this fresh supply of blood? So then some people, would say, oh, well, maybe somebody got an animal, killed it, let it clot or and put it on the shroud. But there are so many, especially with the scourge wounds, all of these blood stains that are close together. How are you going to put multiple, let's say, rodents that you put a gash in and put it on the shroud? Once you start putting several, they're going to start smearing each other.
Can I?
So the technical aspects, and the thing is that these are not. There's no directionality. Well, that's with image, but with the blood stain, what they see is that it's not whole blood, but it's the transfer of blood clot exudates. So the blood clotted on the skin and then transferred onto the cloth. In these tombs that are carved out of stone, from the side of a mountain or whatever, the earth below is going to provide a certain amount of humidity in that man-made cave, and there's likely to be quite a bit of moisture there, so that when it came time to the resurrection, because we have a cloth that has incredible evidence as being the burial cloth of Christ, yet there's no body attached to it. So had the body separate from the cloth without smearing the blood stains, and they talk about menisci, the edges of a blood stain. Like if you drop some blood onto a cloth or a piece of paper, what you're going to see is raised edges. And there's been quite a bit of literature talking about how these edges seem to just keep going. They're not seeing that there has been a separating action. So, but that fits in with how Christ was resurrected, and he could go through walls. So I think he literally just went through.
Interesting. So not disturbing even the smallest trace amounts of blood on the outside of the thread. You're saying those trace amounts have been undisturbed somehow.
That's what the literature is saying, and I'm doing further research on that. But Dr. Barbet, who was a field surgeon in World War I, he before he became a chief surgeon, I think it was at some Paris hospital. But he spoke of that, how he'd seen plenty of bloodstained bandages, and how what he was seeing on the shroud was identical to that. But he wasn't seeing the separation, like if you have some big bloody wound and you're taking the cloth, separating it from the body, that you would expect to see breakup of the blood, but they're not seeing that on the shroud. So the question is, how did the body in a natural way separate from clot? And I don't think that could happen. I think that's evidence of the resurrection.
And Dale, what did you want to add to that?
Just a couple little add-on notes kind of things. So one thing you guys were talking about, like, in terms of assuming it's radiation that formed this thing, it's like a pulse from inside out of the body, and it kind of landed on the cloth. There is some debate in shroud literature as to what's called a cloth collapse hypothesis. So the body vanished, leaving behind a field of radiation, and when that happens, it would suck the cloth down into the radiation and the bottom up into the radiation to some extent. That's scientifically known to happen. Whereas other scientists say, no, it's more like Bob Rucker doesn't believe in cloth collapse. So that's kind of an interesting debate kind of thing. The other thing in terms of blood, so Teddy kind of stole my thunder. I also argue for this there's non-contact zones. So we know scientifically that the blood had to transfer when it was in a liquid state. It's entrenched. It's not superficial. It goes through and shows up on the reverse side of the cloth, unlike the body images. So we know it had to transfer in a liquid state. And there are non-contact zones where it just wouldn't be touching the cloth in the position the body is in, as depicted on the shroud, at least with a naturally draped cloth. So it would take some kind of pressure, maybe by tying it, or some people think by the bundles of spices kind of press the cloth to these areas in order to get the blood to be encoded. But that would lead to what Teddy's saying. There would be some kind of smearing or noticeable alteration to these, and we don't have that. There's another major feature with the bloodstains, and this will be the last thing I say, but it's also really important if you think the bloodstains are painted, there are no body images underneath any of the bloodstains. It terminates precisely, not just the bloodstains, but the serum retraction rings that surround the outside of the bloodstains. That's scientifically impossible for a human being to do. We had modern forensic artists doing their best. There's always going to be some kind of breach of the boundaries. You can't terminate your painting of a body image right at the boundary of this invisible serum retraction rings and not do some kind of damage to the borders of the bloodstains. So that's another feature of the bloodstains that's really impressive.
And where
Awesome.
people have tried to replicate
well
these
guys,
blood
we got
stains,
before we go any further, I think Josh is going to have to split here in a couple minutes. So we're just going to start wrapping up. Maybe we can do a part 2 here. But I do know that we had a couple of things in the audience that people wanted you guys to answer, so I'm gonna transition into that phase so we can move the conversation along. Daniel says, I'm curious as to why Dale prefers particle radiation over Jackson DeLorazzo's suggestion of VUV radiation.
Yeah, so I guess just to be honest, it's kind of the one that made the most sense to me when I read the literature by people who propose that type thing. But yeah, I mean, I have to be honest. These are both extraordinary or quote unquote supernatural type mechanisms. I don't have any particular bias either way. I mean, as long as I can get it being supernatural, I don't really care how it came about. Even people that go for particle radiation are kind of open that, well, maybe we're talking supernatural mechanisms here. Maybe there's some kind of mixture of things going on or something. So I'm not necessarily bound to that. It's just what I think happens to make the most sense.
All right, and here's one for Teddy. I am curious if Teddy has any thoughts on Andrea Nicolati's work.
Well, what in particular about what Nicolati said?
Not sure.
He's a skeptic, so I don't know that there's anything I agree.
All right, and here's the last one by Daniel. He asks, can you ask Dale about the lack of images beneath the bloodstains?
All right. Well, this was the last thing I kind of just mentioned, right? So,
yeah. But go ahead if you want. If there's anything else you want to comment on it.
Yeah.
And
so,
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So I think I pretty much said it. Like this is incredible, and it definitely. I mean, we've tested this. We've had modern forensic artists trying to duplicate this, and it's impossible. They can't. We just don't have the hand-eye brain coordination to account for this feature artistically.
And when they teased out, when they had a fibril and they removed the blood, they didn't see the yellowish color of the image. What they saw was the more white color of the background color. So that's how we know that the blood had to go on first as they wrapped Jesus's body in the shroud. And then on the third day, that's when the image came on. So that's how we know that it was blood first, image second. And the other thing that argues against there being some sort of a forger that painted this in some miraculous way, because you'd have to believe in a miracle if you know the details. nobody could have painted this, but one of the things has to do with the bloodstains, because if the bloodstains have to come on first, then the image, and there's nothing in the shroud that shows an outline, how are they going to know to put the bloodstains in the precise areas of where the wrists are for the nail wounds? And if somebody
Yeah,
was
right.
going to forge it, why would they put the holes in the wrists when traditionally we see it more in the palm? Now that's an exit wound, so it still could have been in the upper part of the palm and then landed out in the wrist. But if you're going to fake it, why not put it where the congregation is expecting to see the wounds? And when people have had stigmata, it's usually in the palm. So why would somebody fake that? It would make sense.
Yeah. Right on. Well, Josh, I'm gonna let you wrap it, man.
Well, I honestly, I am so engaged in what's happening and what's being discussed right now. I'm almost, it's bittersweet for me to have to go, because this was really enlightening, and like I said, this was new ground for me to tread on in terms of study and application and things like that. And I've been really blessed by your guys' enthusiasm and your just the experience and knowledge you had to bring here. I am so appreciative of your time and your attention. Thank you also for the awesome depth of participation that we get in thinking about Christ as a man in the incarnation, and just the concrete aspect of having something that draws our attention back toward that fact, even if it's let's say not 100% provable or anything like that. It's like, I think it's done its job. I really do appreciate David allowing us the space and the time to come on and do this, guest takeover thing. This has been really cool, and I hope to be able to do it again. And I just really appreciate your guys' just overall the level of detail that you've gone into this, and it remains interesting. I'm going to have to do some more reading. We haven't even
fully hit the tip of the iceberg. I mean,
I bet. I bet. I'm sure that there's an inexhaustible amount of things that you could probably just go over, but even just the detail about the blood on the outside of the fibers, and just everything that you guys have discussed so far has given me a lot to think about and a lot to chew on. And I know that Tyler also was really excited to see this come together, and I just am so appreciative and grateful right now. But I do have to hop off, and I got to get to a worship function at my church. I am the drummer for the worship team there, and so I'm involved and have an obligation. I kind of wish I didn't, because this is really very interesting for me at this point. But I do have that obligation. I have to go. But I really am so thankful for everybody that tuned in, and thank you for the questioner, Daniel, and thank you for Dale and Teddy. I really appreciate you both. And your
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's great to hear. We got someone.
We're really excited to spread what we know about it, and we hope that you go on to spread information about it, or to encourage. And shroud.com is the place. It is, it's an inexhaustible source of excellent information about the Shroud, and it's put together by a STIRT member, Barry Schwartz, who is the photographer, and he's Jewish of all things.
Right.
And he's been the biggest source of spreading the word about the Shroud. Isn't it something?
Right on. Well, guys, again, Guest Host Month continues for the rest of February. Again, we thank our hosts and our participants. Have a good day, y'all.
Thank you so much.